All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining in today. We're excited to host our first Ideas India webinar on financing the future of food investments in the smart protein sector. For those of you joining us today that are either fundraising startups or investors that are looking at opportunities within India's smart protein sector, you're in the right place. We've gathered for you for investors that we've been regularly interacting with to seek out and analyze opportunities that the smart protein sector in India provides, and we're excited for the discussions that will be coming to you this evening. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to the GF Ideas India community. This is an initiative run by GFI India. We are currently a community of over 1,000 stakeholders, including entrepreneurs, investors, students, corporate partners, as well as researchers that are focused on the smart protein sector in India. We provide a bunch of resources as well as regularly host webinars like these to make sure that you are hearing from the experts within the smart protein sector in India as well as globally. If you are currently a startup that is fundraising, we would encourage you to join GFI India's Entrepreneur Directory. By joining the directory, you will access the latest news from the sector as well as hear about events that are most relevant for startups, as well as gain access to partnership opportunities across the value chain. We also regularly share this directory with investors for them to analyze what startups' current needs are with regard to fundraising, as well as share access to this directory across the community for supporting you on any requirements you have on your supply chain sourcing, on hiring, on distribution and manufacturing opportunities. If you are currently fundraising, I would also encourage you to submit a request on GFI India's fundraising support. We provide 3 types of support to fundraising startups. We provide you with a pitch deck review where we are able to provide you feedback to help you strengthen your pitch deck before you go in front of investors. We also provide an opportunity for a practice pitch deck session where you can deliver your pitch over a video call to the team at GFI India, where we'll be able to provide you feedback on your deck and your delivery. And then finally, you will also be able to access GFI India's investor directory. The directory lists investors that have expressed interest in funding alternative protein startups in India, and you will be able to connect with investors. If you are an investor that is currently joining us and you are interested in investing in companies within the sector, there's a couple of things that you can do. I would encourage you again to join GFI India's investor directory, through which you can get inbound deal flow. We only share access to the directory to fundraising startups. You can also access GFI India's Entrepreneur Directory, which lists specifically Indian companies, as well as GFI's global company database, and a fundraising database, which lists out companies that are fundraising globally. I would also encourage you to subscribe to GFI Global's quarterly investor newsletter, give you insights on the investment landscape globally. And apart from that, there are a bunch of other initiatives that you can do on your public markets, whether that's investing in publicly traded holding companies, whether that's investing in public alternative protein companies like Beyond Meat and Oatly, as well as using your proxy voting rights and activist strategies to encourage food and agriculture companies that you've already invested in to focus on alternative proteins. With that, I think we can get started with the session today. Great. All right, so for today's session, we have with us Michal Klar, co-founder of Better Bite Ventures. Betabyte is focused on early stage startups in the APAC region that are currently using plant-based, cultivated, and precision fermentation technologies to build a better food system. Michael has spent 15 years scaling up consumer tech startups in Europe and Asia. Also the author of the Future Food Now newsletter, which covers the alternative protein landscape ecosystem in Asia Pacific. We have Shruti Srivastava, who manages investments at Avaana Capital and brings over 10 years of experience across early stage investing, private equity, and development finance. Prior to joining Avaana, Shruti was Omnivore, an agri-tech focused venture fund in India. And before that, she worked with Acumen, a global impact venture fund. We have Robert Boer from Blue Horizon. He is currently the program director responsible for Blue Horizon's seed portfolio. He has over 15 years of experience managing programs in large financial services firms across Europe. Most recently, he also built and ran UBS's Global Visionaries program, identifying and supporting impact-driven entrepreneurs at the forefront of tackling some of the world's most challenging social as well as environmental problems. And finally, we have Samir Shah, managing partner at Peak Sustainability Ventures, a pure play sustainability VC fund. He's extremely passionate about sustainability and has deep domain expertise across verticals, including energy, agriculture, water, and climate, built through his investment experience, operating positions, and industry affiliations over the past decade. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am excited to get straight into it. For all the attendees today, we will be going through a round of questions for our panel to help you understand more about what their thesis is across the sector, as well as what they look for in startups that they are interested in investing in. Have a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. So if you have any questions that come up during the panel discussion, I would encourage you to put them into the Q&A box so we don't miss them at the end of the session. So with that, we'll get started with a round of questions about what each of you do, as well as what your interest is in the smart protein sector. So Shruti, start with you. At Ivana and previously at Omnivore, you've built a thriving ecosystem of support for entrepreneurs as well as startups with a focus on agri-tech. Would you be able to share more about your work and what specifically excites you about smart protein?
Sure. So Avaana is an early stage fund that is looking at backing innovation to solve for climate and sustainability issues. And you cannot look at climate without looking at the impact that food systems have on climate, either as an emitter or as a sufferer of adverse climate impact. What we find interesting about the smart protein ecosystem is that it allows transition from a high emitting value chain to actually building more climate resilient value chains. So on one side, you have your animal agriculture and livestock space, which has massive resource requirements for per kg of nutrition that's produced. And on the other hand, you can transition that entire chain to plant proteins from legumes, which tend to have a much higher resilience to climate impact. So it becomes like a win-win situation in a way. Additionally, as we look at food and nutritional security for India, we are a particularly protein deficient nation. And if we want protein consumption for our large population to be on par with what's the medically prescribed requirement, our land and water resources as is will not be able to suffice for that requirement via animal agriculture. And so we see this new form of protein acquisition getting developed. We will see interesting products and markets and value chains getting built that will be more, that will prevent us from trading off people versus planet.
Thanks for that. And with that, Samir, I want to bring you on because you're doing some really excellent work in mobilizing capital towards climate-focused technologies, specifically in the Indian context. So would you tell us more about how momentum for a broader climate-focused thesis is increasing and how this area could potentially, how this area of smart protein could potentially form a pillar of that whole thesis?
Sure. No, thanks, Nicole. Thanks for your comment. So we at Peak are sustainability focused fund, which are investing in four verticals. First is new energy, second is agriculture, third is water, and fourth is climate tech, where we include plastics, biodiversity, etc. So smart protein falls squarely within agriculture in terms of the investment pieces that we have, and also tangentially into water and climate tech. So smart protein actually is a crucial part plays a crucial role in terms of how we think about investments. The reason we have picked these four sectors is they are all correlated. You can't think about these sectors as silos. It should be mentioned, I think what happens in climate impacts agriculture. What happens in agriculture impacts climate. We can go through that in more detail as the conversation progresses. So our investments are, in regenerative agriculture, protection of topsoil, saving of resources. I mean, if we can do, broadly speaking, more with less, that overarching idea sort of goes through the four verticals that I talked about. And, in terms of plant protein versus animal protein, I think it's about 4 to 8 times the resource intensity, depending on the specifics that we can talk about that animal protein have vis-a-vis plant protein. And 15% of global emissions today come from sort of livestock, which is sort of not as prominent as mobility and the other. I think people associate GHG emissions. You turn on the car and there are emissions, but the subtlety of how much agriculture contributes overall, and just in terms of livestock, you have almost, let's say 50 million square kilometers, which is under agriculture, out of which 35 million are pastures. So you have also a large proportion of land being used for pastures, which are indirectly, obviously supporting the meat protein industry. Overall, as well, we see this sector as a sunrise sector. I mean, plant-based meat sales last year roughly were about $4 billion globally, and plant-based milk are $16.9 billion globally. We see the sector as perhaps showing exponential growth in the years ahead. So with the mix of new technologies and new companies starting to look at smart protein and extraction concepts, with the move towards the people, I mean, everyone's saying, look, we need to do this for people and for planet, because the health benefits of plant protein are now known very well, as opposed to some of the other health issues that can be from meat and other protein sources. So from a health perspective, health of the person, health of the planet, and an overall sustainability perspective, we believe smart protein will have a key role to play in the decades ahead. And we are seeing more and more interesting companies. One specific one we have invested in, but our horizon, on our horizon are a number of other companies which are doing work in this space, and we see a bright future ahead for this subsector.
Great, thank you for that, Samir. Robert Blue Horizon, of course, invests in alternative protein across the landscape of plant-based cultivated fermentation and at various stages of companies' life cycles. What is it about the Asia Pacific market and particularly India that excites you?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for inviting us. Listen, we've been in this game since 2017, and also a big supporter of GFI, by the way, when it still was a small entity in the US. Happy that you are flocking around the world and creating these great ecosystems in India and other places where we really need to bring alternative proteins to. To answer your question, I mean, we spent a lot of time in research, and one of the more well-known publications that we've done last year was together with Boston Consulting Group, where we basically developed a quantified market model to predict how the alternative protein industry will develop over the next 10 years. And what's striking in that model is that 2/3 of the proteins will be consumed in Asia, which which is not a big surprise, but still, if you look at the amount of investment going into Asia versus the amount of consumers that will be in Asia in the next 10 years for this particular type of protein, I think there's a huge mismatch. And so one of my roles, I basically two investment theses in my sort of responsibility per seed. One is getting into the technologies that can potentially be game-changing when it comes to bringing taste, texture, price, and convenience to parity with meat and dairy, animal protein-based. And second is to go into emerging markets and start being some of the earlier investors in countries like India, Latin America. I also really want to go into China, but it's not so easy. And really try to help build the ecosystem, bring foreign capital in, try to sort of bring our knowledge and expertise and into the country. So Michael and I, we're actually working on a very interesting deal together. It's probably going to be our first deal as Blue Horizon in India, and it's probably going to be another couple of ones soon. And I'm very excited about the market, what I've learned over the last couple of months. So, lot to come.
Thank you for that. Michael, you've been a key business advisor and investor to hugely successful alternative protein companies within the APAC region. With Better Bite Ventures, you're looking to further accelerate the industry in Asia. Could you highlight for us what opportunities this region presents for the industry globally?
Sure. Thanks, Nicole, for having me, and thanks again as well for all the work that GFI India and you are doing for the smart protein sector in India and beyond. Yes, we are. So we are the fund that is only investing in Asia Pacific in All Protein. So we believe that I think Robert was talking a little bit about it, that Asia is already the largest protein market and the fastest growing protein market in the world, but it is also underinvested. So I think if I remember numbers right, it was around 300 million invested out of 5 billion total in Asia Pacific last year in All Protein. So clearly we need more funding, more startups, more VCs, and more other corporate investors involved in this space. What we believe, so the obvious opportunity is just in the fact that this is the largest and fastest growing protein market by itself, and huge consumer market with a very interesting underlying trends of emerging middle class. But I think there's also another opportunity where Asia can become and some specific markets for some specific technologies, sort of a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. Obviously, that happened in many other industries, and I think with this new approach to smart technology-driven protein, it's becoming also an opportunity for places like India and other large markets in Asia to utilize basically the skills, the workforce, the technology that is already there, and potentially produce at scale this protein and export to other parts of the world as well.
Thank you for that, and excited to know more about the deal you are both investing in a couple of months when that is announced. But in line with that, we're seeing a huge uptick in market activity protein in India. So while plant-based milks have been around for some time now, over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of activity specifically in the plant-based meat space, and we've seen a number of launches. So currently there are products available in over 19 Indian cities. Some of these brands have secured investments and endorsed from mainstream celebrities. We've seen Indian plant-based meat brands advertise on TV recently. So we're really seeing some movement towards the mainstream. And each of you have worked with us to evaluate companies as well as opportunities in the space. But we'd really love, in this session right now, I'd really love to drill down to what gaps you believe still exist. So Shruti, if we can start with you, how would you categorize the kinds of entrepreneurs that you're seeing enter the space right now, and whether you're seeing any gaps, either if it's in terms of industry experience or technical talent, And what is it that startups really need to be focusing on before they come forward for fundraising with an investor like you?
Sure. So we're seeing 2-3 different kinds of business models emerge in the space. The first and the most common one is around building a consumer brand for plant protein products. The second is around novel ingredients. And the third category is your deep science startups around precision fermentation or lab meat startups. So if I take the first one, the nature of teams that are required and the kind of skill sets that are required are present in the Indian startup ecosystem today, because the dynamics of the business will derive heavily from how D2C brands, particularly integrated D2C brands, have gotten built in India. So we have folks who understand leveraging distribution, who understand digital brand building, who understand how to advocate and convert to this consumer segment. Because let's face it, the early adopters are going to be your India one segment, as we call it, right? The 55 million consumers at the top who try out the first consumer internet platforms that come out, or who become the early adopters for your entire D2C brand wave that we've seen. So in this particular business model, we have seen some smart founders come up. The gaps that we are seeing today are twofold. One is definitely around food scientists who can build compelling products. Because for the Indian consumers, there are just 3 things that matter when it comes to adoption: taste, taste, and taste. Right. So if it's something that leaves a beanie or a bitter aftertaste, it's not going to work. So there is need for smart food science guys to come in and work with these brand creators to create compelling products that can then leverage your D2C food wave and that same infrastructure for distribution and marketing. In the second category, which is your novel ingredients category, that requires deeper understanding of chemistry, food chemistry in particular. There, the challenges that we see are more intrinsic to the Indian ecosystem. So while we've seen strong innovators, I think they need to be paired with people who have a strong B2B business sense. And the second challenge that we see in this particular business model is around the time it takes for sales to pick up. Because the innovator will partner with some platform like a Javadon, which will then work with your end consumer company. They will test out the product internally, then they will roll it out to external clients. And so it's a fairly long sales cycle. And even if you have a great ingredient, it's not necessary that the end product succeeds. And so that business model creates challenges. And there is significant amount of time and cost that goes in building that piece out. In India, the investment ecosystem is not really ready for those kinds of businesses. So in Israel, we have seen the Novopros of the world get funded very massively. In India, there is still a gap as far as the funding ecosystem is concerned for business ideas of these sort, because these are longer gestation businesses. The third is around deep science startups, which is where we've seen interesting stuff that's still lab scale, and a lot more needs to be seen on how that lab to pilot and pilot to commercial can happen. And it's again a fairly long road, and which is where we need more folks who understand life sciences and the business elements of life sciences to come in and support.
With that, I'd love to bring Samir on just to respond, but also Samir, could you frame for us what priorities currently look like for you when you're thinking about investing in smart protein companies? You've invested in Proeon, which is a novel ingredient startup. So, what were some areas of consideration for you, and what gaps are you still seeing as you continue to evaluate the space?
Sure. No, thanks, Nicole. So for us, I think, investing in Proion was done on the basis of understanding what they are looking to do. And I see the way I see what, Shruti has laid out as brands, intermediates, and lab scale. So lab scale is clearly not something that is on the horizon. We have looked at the other two. We have looked at brand builders, and we have looked at companies like Proion, which are looking to do intermediates and supply to very large corporations. And we see actually more advantage in investing in them versus supporting somebody who is doing a brand. Because a brand today requires a lot of spend on ads and market building. Whereas we would like to support entrepreneurs who are solving tough problems. If I were to sort of take a word from, Sir Partho Dasgupta's, he's written now, a 600-700 page, publication on the economics of diversity. So he said, what we need is the scaling up of cutting edge technologies. So that is what drives a lot of our core focus. And that is not only in smart protein, but across the other verticals as well. So we would think that the right combination is a combination of entrepreneurs who are building sort of products that are intermediates, but are not competing with Nestle or Unilever at the shelf space, because you cannot outcompete them on costs. On costs that they would have or spend that they would have on advertisement. And we would think that VC money is better spent today in company building moats in terms of product than in terms of end brand. Branding will come later, but as of now, I think that is where our energies and our efforts have gone. So I agree with Shruti that, look, this is not a space which a lot of people invest in, but we think of ourselves as being pioneers. We are never followers. So I would invest in things which we believe can be scaled up on a global basis, because if you're building a brand, it's very hard for a startup to think of building a global brand. Whereas on the intermediates, you solve that problem. They are saying, look, I'm actually becoming your collaborator. And the other model that we like is the fact that startup should try to focus on its areas of strengths and find ways of collaboration in terms of how you can actually build a product. So if extrusion is your main sort of competitive advantage, I think you say, look, you focus on that. And you mentioned Proion. So they had looked at almost 30 plus different types of extraction, agricultural sort of commodities, and seeing how you extract value from that. And that, to my mind, creates long-term value within the company. And the other part that we look at is extreme focus. And also I would sort of add that an entrepreneur in smart protein has a very different mindset than a SaaS entrepreneur. It's somebody who has a passion for what they are doing, thinks long term, and is committed to a cause. Otherwise, it's and I think we knew Kevin and Ashish for about 4 years. So the decision when they came up for funding on this became an easier one, and we would like to support not only the next round but the subsequent round as well, because we are in regular touch with them. We like people who collaborate with us and connect with us to see how we can together build value. That is the core of how we think about investing companies at Peak, that this is not a quarterly reporting situation. This is more like, how do we build a great business together? There are still gaps in this, I do agree. We could have a laundry list of gaps, but the key comment I would make is that supporting smart entrepreneurs, solving a tough problem that at scale can make a difference to the world, is sort of the lens through which we evaluate companies.
Thank you for that. And with that, Robert, I'd love if you bring a sort of global lens to this, but what sort of evidence do you look for as companies, begin going out into market, and how have you seen that differ across geographies? And if you could bring in some analysis that you've had or some reading that you've had from your study of the Indian sector, I think would be hugely helpful for our audiences.
Yeah, I just want to also comment a little bit on the two previous panelists, if I may. So you wouldn't see us investing in a consumer brand in developed markets so much anymore, right? Because we did that in 2017 and 18 when Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods were just starting to develop the category. We, in terms of seed investments, since we do that from our own balance sheet, we're very patient, and we also have different objectives with these investments. One of that is learning. So I would very much be interested in consumer brands in emerging markets, because they will teach us a lot about how consumers behave, how they think, how they purchase, what their taste and texture preferences are, and gives us a lot of feedback in terms of what other more enabling technologies need to be invested in order to solve problems that the consumers are facing. So that's, and the other thing is indeed an enabler like Proion is indeed something that I'd be very interested in as well, because what I like about those kind of companies is that, especially in markets that have a lot of natural commodities, they source the ingredients locally, and they really create more value out of these ingredients and supply them to the local market. And what really surprised me from talking to a lot of Indian companies over the last couple of months, everyone is importing the texturized or extruded products outside of India. So there's no capacity whatsoever when it comes to extrusion, TVP, or any type of technology. And I think that's a big white space which we need to solve, not only in India but in other large growing markets, and also around fermentation and cultivated. I mean, we're gonna hit a big bottleneck when it comes to infrastructure capacity. And that's where India, I think, can really step up. I think there's a lot of smart people in India. There's a lot of talent there. There's a sort of labor arbitrage you can have when it comes to talent and capacity. There's arguably less capex intensive investments that you need to do in India than if you build something in San Francisco. So I think there's a lot of potential there, which also alludes a bit to Michael's point, saying it should be more a production center of Asia, and that's where I really see the opportunity. It's hard to invest in these things because normally venture capitalists, they don't want to invest in steel. So there's a big role for GFI to play to start lobbying with local governments, politicians, to really make them understand that there's a big opportunity here for India to really become a large player in this industry when it comes to producing these products. India should not have to import this from outside of India. That's just mind blowing. And so that's I think what I wanted to say on the previous discussion. Then there's sort of a global perspective, right, on this. We invest indeed in all countries in the world, and we would not, like I said, invest so much in consumer brands anymore in developing countries. We really look for the new technologies that can be disruptive. So like plant cell culture, gas fermentation, and these are probably moonshots when it comes to, will this ever become a proper financial return? But we've got to learn so much from these companies, and there's a lot of synergies that we can create in our portfolio by bringing new technologies into some of our other companies that we invested in. The other thing that we really do a lot, and I also bring the Asia conversation in these partnerships as well, is we building a lot of relationships with the big corporates, and really try to influence them in going into this space more aggressively, and do a lot of research. We just did research with MSCI, for example, publicly listed companies, and how their value is at risk if they don't go into All Protein, and go with this report to the big retailers and food manufacturers and say, come on guys, we need to work on this, and what the opportunity lies mostly in Asia. And so there's a lot of players we need to bring into this field, government, corporate, and a lot of entrepreneurs that may perhaps come from the existing industry. Some of the companies that we're speaking to, they have founders that have 20, 30 years experience in the food and in the meat and dairy space, and they sort of got this moment in their life that they want to do something more impactful. We need to grab these people. We need to bring that talent into our industry, and the knowledge of the market that they bring and the distribution and the production. That's great. So I really see a lot of opportunities there.
Yep, thank you for that. I think what we've been seeing, and I think which is unique to India or really the emerging market context, is entrepreneurs here really have to build out that entire innovation stack themselves. So whether that is, building out relationships across the value, whether that's building out relationships for manufacturing, for distribution, for marketing and positioning, for category awareness, for R&D, it's really them having to build out that entire stack. And so what we've been doing at GFI is really trying to get stakeholders across the value chain to really see the opportunity that alternative protein provides. And I think having discussions like this and conversations like this and hearing experiences from a global perspective as well is always helpful, just in terms of contextualizing the opportunity that's really presented by the Indian market. So thank you for that, Robert. Michael, you've been working with a number of entrepreneurs in the sector, especially in India, and because you're obviously resolved to help build this sector up across Asia. What is the key difference that you're seeing from some of the entrepreneurs here in the Indian context in terms of how raw they may be? And are there any sort of general characteristics that you look for before you go into and invest with them? And how do we work to close some of the gaps that Robert mentioned as well?
Okay, let me try to address this. So yeah, I think generally, I'm really always very inspired and by just how entrepreneurial the Indian ecosystem is. So we meet a lot of entrepreneurs from India, and they want to do amazing work, impactful work, and often make some good early progress with very little resources. So they're extremely resourceful. So it's really, really positive development. And I think right now, when we look at sort of our modeling of Asia and we look at just sheer numbers, the number of startups in All Protein startups or smart protein startups in India is higher than in any other market in Asia. So that's a positive sign. I think in terms of what we are looking at for us and for our specific thesis, it's not different in India than elsewhere in Asia, because we mostly invest in emerging markets. So some of the characteristics are similar. And I think probably most of them are actually very typical for all investors, or definitely all All Protein investors. So the three main categories for us are people, product, and market/impact. We kind of group market and impact together. In terms of people, what's really important for us is that the team is complete. It's the completeness of the team. So very often we are looking at especially more of the biotech companies. We want to make sure that there is a strong relevant science background in the team, but there's also a business background. Sometimes it's the same person, sometimes those are two different people in the team. What I think maybe is a little underrated sometimes is how important the ability to be persuasive is from founders, because there are so many stakeholders along the way, starting from investors, but also customers, employees, and so on. And the main skill of entrepreneur is really to persuade various stakeholders to join them on the journey, right? And we really spend time trying to understand whether the founder or founders have what it takes to be persuasive enough, in their journey and attract all these important stakeholders. And then it sort of links to the something we spend quite a bit of time on, like trying to understand the story and the narrative behind the startup. because each startup each has a founding story, and each founder has his own story or her own story. And I think it's important for us for this story to be coherent and interesting and unique, and again, like linking it to persuasive, like inspiring all this other folks to join the journey. But on the product side, what's interesting about our investing, and we invest very early, we invest in pre-seed and seed, so there's often not much there to see. There's often no product really to taste or to see, so it's a little bit tricky. That's why we over-indexed the team and people. But with product, we still would like to see some, any proof points, any prototypes. Sometimes it's actually coming from previous experience. I meet regularly startups that have some sort of a smaller scale food product that they first, maybe in the previous startup or previous venture that they manufactured, and then they're moving to something much more bigger. I still want to chase and try and see what's going on with this other product, because that's a good proof point of what is their quality, standard, and what they can really do with limited resources. But also with the product, it's really important that we look at the scalability potential. So can this product scale? Can this product and this category grow really big? And the last bit that we are looking at is market and impact. So, we want to make sure we invest in markets that are really large. So we wouldn't invest in the product that we consider niche. So we really might want to make sure that the product and the company is addressing really large market. And often, by virtue of investing in All Protein or Smart Protein, we are making positive impact when it comes to environment and animal welfare. And this is what really is important for us. But we still want to maximize this impact. So we are trying to measure as much as we can how much impact this specific product can do in terms of replacement of more harmful way of producing protein using especially intensive animal agriculture with other technologies. So this is a very important part for us as well. And then your question, I think, in terms of closing some of these gaps, it's a big topic. I think we definitely. There are no easy solutions, but I agree with most of the things that were said so far. We definitely need, in India specifically, more sourcing of more of the local ingredients. It is truly shocking to discover that, almost everything is imported when it comes to inputs, the major protein inputs. I think there are some interesting startups working with local ingredients like mung bean protein and a few others. So we're really excited about this. Of course, long way to go to actually scale it, and a lot of challenges. Now, I think one of the interesting technologies and areas that we really look at is precision fermentation for India specifically. So there's robust biopharma scale-up industry in India right now. I think something like 50% or more than 50% of world's vaccines are produced in India. So we do believe that one of the ways, maybe the most efficient, effective ways to close some of these gaps on more of the biotech side is to actually encourage some of these biopharma companies to step into food. And I think it's slowly happening. Some of the companies have announced and started to work on facilities, sort of using their skills and presence in this biopharma scale, but with sort of driving more into food grade scale, and food grade facilities. So I think both on a corporate level where these companies can invest, and also on talent level where we can tap into the existing talent working at these facilities, that creates this strong opportunity. And this actually goes to local startups that can then utilize this infrastructure, but also to some extent international startups that would like to potentially use India as a manufacturing hub.
Yep. Samir.
Yeah, Nicole, just two quick comments. I think, one is that even though there are a number of entrepreneurs in this space, I think as a percent or as related to the opportunity, there are fewer than one would expect, which sort of has a role for GFI to say, look, the attractiveness of this sector and perhaps the scalability and what the next decade can look like for the sector is not very clear to entrepreneurs in broad sense. So I think that, puts you in a position of influence where you can influence outcomes by spreading the word. And I mean, all of us on the panel are very, very, very willing to help you because we want to see the sector prosper. But you as an institution can clearly sort of, not broadcast, but use your resources to sort of, state the importance and demonstrate the importance of the space overall. I think one other comment made just to respond to what Robert said earlier. I mean, absolutely. I think, we should be finding more Indian plants where we can test the functionality, the extrusion possibility. And one comment we did not make, which I wanted to make earlier, was that why should we be extracting only proteins? I mean, we cannot, if you're looking at sustainability, we are saying, look, at the next step, you should be looking to extract even the carbohydrates and the oil as well. Because if it is there in the plant, there is no point in sort of throwing it away, so to speak. But broadly speaking, there is enough to do with the availability of various pulses in India and testing them to see how they can be sort of converted, or how you can test them to make plant protein, which is either replacement of eggs, replacement of dairy, or meat. Actually. So that, I think, is a much higher priority. And I think that, the biopharma companies can look at fermentation, but for a startup, it would be very expensive in terms of capex to look at fermentation technologies.
Thanks for that, Samir. And I think at GFI, what we're doing specifically within GFI India is really calling for what we're calling a sort of mission for smart protein, and really bringing together, stakeholders across policy, across science, across business on the table to work together and really bridge some of these gaps that we're talking about right now that have been obvious for the industry over the last 2 years as we're growing as well. And we are seeing some movement towards it, but there's a lot that needs to be done. And, we look forward to working with all of you on sort of supporting us in building some of those gaps. And in saying that, I'd love to get your perspectives as investors on how you're seeing the sort of ecosystem for alternative proteins evolve globally as well, and how startups in India can also best position themselves to take advantage of that global maturity that the sector is moving towards. So if we could start off with you, Robert, we're seeing the category really, grow globally. And then there's also a potential for sort of a mass drop-off of companies in the coming years as, superior category leaders kind of emerge within the industry. So in saying that, how should startups in India as well be positioning themselves for long-term growth and taking advantage of these, global supply chains that are kind of developing across the industry?
Yeah, so I think the last couple of years I've seen fairly amount of Indian startups joining like incubator and accelerator programs outside of India. I think that's a really good development. Samir would probably say, yeah, look at ProReal. They are now going into the biotech campus in the Netherlands, in Delft, to further develop sort of their protein technologies and then bring them back to India as an expertise to really create that hub that we are looking for. And I think a lot of these ingredient plays are I like the idea of ingredient plays for the local markets, really serving local markets first. Because I think the consumers are in India mostly and in the region as well. But there's obviously a lot of demand for cheap proteins by global companies, and so a lot of these companies are looking at India to source high quality, lower cost proteins, oils, carbohydrates, with high functionality. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for Indian companies to provide that. Then there's a huge Indian population outside of India as well. So even for the consumer brands, tapping into the large Indian communities in Europe and the US and bringing their products into these communities, I think that's a huge potential as well. But again, I normally prefer companies to focus on the local market first, because there's just so many mouths to feed. And I really ask every company to show me how they're gonna bring the cost down to a point where they can actually serve the underserved, because that's where the real impact is. My biggest worry about this sector is that it stays in this sort of premium, vegan hippie niche, and we contribute to that a little bit as well, because we sort of bet on the companies that are sort of producing the products for that sort of particular segment. But I like to change that. I really like to go into the regions where companies are working on technologies and on products that actually are at parity with the cheapest meat in the country, or not even compete with meat. It's just a better product. It's more nutritious, it's more available, it's cheaper, and it's produced in a way that it can really scale to those unit economics. And I think that's where the real power is. And that's where you get me really excited, because we are very much impact first company, right? Even though we have a lot of colleagues in our firm with a capitalistic mindset, we all believe that the only way to solve this issue is to get these proteins, alternative proteins, in the hands and mouths of everyone. And so I think India is a perfect example where this could really work. First, you go into more premium products because you just don't have to scale yet. But I think there's a lot of fundamentals in the Indian economy that can really drive that cost to parity quick, and then even outside of India, supply sort of global brands to also help them get more competitive in their own markets. So I think that's where I really like to see the opportunity go. And let's see, in the next 10 years, we should be able to do that together.
So, Michael, I want to quickly go to you. Firstly, if you have anything additional to add to Robert's points, but also, I mean, we've been talking, Asia being the new all protein hotspot, and sort of seeing that shift in the all protein center of gravity move officially eastwards. What really do we need to see from investors and startups to make that happen?
Yeah, the good points from Robert. Not so much something to add, but I was thinking about sort of founders' perspective on this. I think it's important for founders, especially early on in a country like India and other emerging markets in Asia, to think through this target markets, right? So do they actually address the local market first, local consumers, or are they trying to position themselves for export and being kind of the hub, or utilize this sort of a hub concept and attract more of a Western consumers? And when they do, it's also important that they think through the specific challenges, right? So often we like, I'm talking from experience. So sometimes we talk with early stage founders and they have certain ideas of which markets or consumers they would like to address, but they haven't really analyzed, the challenges around this market. They cannot answer in an informed way what are the ways and challenges around exporting, for example, out of India, right? Or positioning themselves in this often very different markets that they haven't had that experience with. So just encouraging founders to do some background work and research and think it through. But we also have a slide bias into addressing mostly the local consumers. We believe that the opportunity in Asia is so huge. Yes, it is more long-term. Yes, maybe Western consumer is more already there, in terms of actively seeking out for these products. But I think in the long term, Asia will be definitely the bigger market. And what needs to be done? I think it's fairly simple. We just need more funding. I think this is this kind of a classic chicken and egg problem. But like we need more entrepreneurs, but we also need more funding. And if there's more robust funding ecosystem, I think more and better entrepreneurs will also be there. So I think the work that you guys are doing at GFI and and to some extent, all of us here on the panel to promote this ecosystem, to encourage more folks to get involved, both on entrepreneurship side and on investment side. I think it's all very important.
Thank you for that. Samir, just to quickly move to you. The climate space specifically in India is yet to sort of, wake up to the opportunity that smart retail potentially presents for them. So how can startups better position themselves to be considered more seriously by funds like yours and other climate-focused funds?
Sure. I just would like to make one point before I respond to your comment. I think, when we are talking about startups, and when we think about technology, technology is global and technology respects no barriers. So, when we think about products, I think we generally, whether in energy, for example, we think about it globally, that you solve a problem here, it has universal applicability, and vice versa. We try to bring solutions developed internationally, into India as well. So I think the point is that, look, in terms of, the growth of the sector, I think any product development that is done internationally is also applicable to India. So when Indian companies tell us, well, we have no competitors in India, I said, you've got to think globally. You can't just think of India as a sector unless you are doing only consumers. That's just a point I wanted to make earlier. With respect to your comment, I think, the avoided emissions that plant-based proteins can bring are generally not well known. And we, in our own way, try to talk about it through our ecosystem, through the people we speak to, through the investors we speak to. Because the emissions, when there is this race for net zero and the result of, which is sort of the GHG emission reduction, it is generally thought about in energy without considering that overall 25% of emissions come from agriculture. Out of that, a substantial portion comes from sort of the pastoral land. And if you look at the full lifetime cost of food, it is much, much higher, because you've got to think of production, consumption, as well as what happens to food after it is either wasted or disposed of. And some of the ugly statistics, even in India, where you say 25-30% of the food is wasted, you could say it differently. To say 30% of land under cultivation, you could have just taken the production and thrown it in the dustbin. It is the same, it's the same point, but it's made differently. So I think awareness is a good starting point, but you can't stop at awareness. It's awareness followed by action that needs to happen. And I would say that, look, perhaps, as I was saying earlier, even in terms of the entrepreneurs, I think it applies overall as well, that the sensitivity of what, avoided emissions that replacement of, meat-based protein to plant-based protein can do overall, not only for health, but also for the health of the planet as well, is not very well understood. So that, I think, requires a system by which policy makers, government, private sector, large companies, your organization, us, everyone, it's like we are all in this together, and the food issue touches us all. And, one of the things we should rethink about when you think about climate is it also impacts adjacencies like water, just in terms of quality and the quantity of water. It also impacts land use change in the sense that, the extent to which you would have to have, kind of more land which would come from deforestation, which impacts biodiversity. So the interconnectivity is such where the reduction of the footprint of agriculture and the reduction of resources that are needed to provide, the recommended level of protein, which is required for a human consumption. I believe it's 50 grams per person per day, is sort of what is needed. And it's not an easy sort of a problem to solve, but we must begin today. I think if we don't begin, you're not going to solve it. And it's something where the whole ecosystem needs to come together. In addition to us as funders, I think, as I was mentioning, more entrepreneurs looking to solve tough problems, more of the government sort of policies, targeted to that. And I think more of an understanding as to, do you know the carbon footprint of your food footprint? And that relates to a broader issue as to food miles as well, which is not a part of this conversation, but local production, local consumption aspects, which need to be also factored into overall to say, look, have you thought of the energy used in transporting your food 1,000 kilometers? I mean, these are all sort of ancillary aspects of, again, broadly speaking, agriculture, but also sort of, in terms of smart protein. I think the more the impact is known and the sort of more and more people are sensitized to what you can do, I would say I'm sort of being an optimist. I think that change will happen, but don't expect it to happen tomorrow morning. But we have to begin the journey.
Thank you for that, Samir. Shruti, I would love to bring you in to just sort of this discussion. We've been talking for many years now, and you've been evaluating the space, and a lot has evolved since I think the first time that you looked at the smart protein sector 2 years ago. Avaana is also raising a fund focused on climate and sustainability as well. So if we could just get your comments on here in terms of what more needs to be done for startups to sort of attract some of this capital that's flowing into the sector, and could you speak to some of your learnings that you've seen as the ecosystems evolve as well?
Sure. So, Nicole, all of transformative sectors usually see an inflection point happening. 2-3 years ago, the sector was too nascent in India to attract a lot of investor attention. People believed that the markets were very small, the products were still underdeveloped, and the capital efficiency required to really reach large markets was just not there. Today, a lot of that is different. We're seeing more founders attempt solutions for this space and across the spectrum, right? Whether it is brands, whether it is ingredients. We're seeing more receptivity in capital allocators as well. So there is, this emergence of specialized pools of capital that understand the space. Pick any sector, be it financial inclusion, be it consumer foods, be it agriculture in the past. Usually when the sector starts to build out, it's specialist investors that are often required to help seed that sector. And with the folks present on this panel, you will see that those shoots are also emerging. So I would say there is that inflection point which is happening. And I've seen how founders in the space have also evolved from being pure innovators to folks who will also be able to build businesses. And this would be a good point for a shout out to GFI for all the work that you guys have done over the last 3-4 years, particularly in building out the ecosystem, bringing the different elements of the ecosystem together, whether it is helping startups network with other service providers that can help them scale, or connect with policy or connect with sources of capital. So I think that definitely deserves a shout out. And yeah, so I think we are at the inflection point where the space will become a lot more attractive to investors. The first wave will be specialists who understand the climate impacts of food and what that really means and what kind of business opportunity that presents. And slowly we will see, crowding in happen with other investors as well.
Great, thank you all so much. Just checking if there are any closing comments or responses from any of our panelists before we move into a quick round of Q&A from the audience. Yeah.
No,
Yes.
no, not a closing comment, but a response to what Robert mentioned in terms of cost. And we have done a lot of work in solar. So if I were to take an example from there, the price of solar has dropped from over 17 rupees in 2015 to under 4 rupees today. So any new technology initially may not be able to compete on cost, but there has to, this is something that as you scale up and as the technology evolves and as innovation evolves, basically, that cost curve does come down. The same can be said about lithium-ion batteries as well, where we were and where we are at $150 kilowatt hour, the numbers were much, much higher. The same can be said about hydrogen. So I would say that even if costs are higher initially, I think it's a roadmap over the next 2-3 years that should drive, that drives our investment. We don't shy away from investing because the cost today is higher than the alternative, because that is the observation looking at many adjacent sectors in the space to say that the cost curve does come down as you see more and more participants, more and more innovation, and the scale build up. That's the only comment I would just want to.
Thank you for that, Samir. I am happy to move into Q&A now. Michael, there's a question for you in the chat. How are you imagining physical infrastructure to play out for fermentation and cultivated technologies in India?
Yeah, I think I partially answered this before speaking about this existing biopharma infrastructure. I generally believe that the best way, especially for emerging markets, to really build up this infrastructure that is necessary is via existing adjacent industries, if it's available, because these are people who have expertise, have capital, and it's just sort of the easiest business move and decision for them to step into this essentially very similar industry. So I think again, biopharma scale-ups, CDMOs in India, this is probably the best way to go here, and this is specifically for precision fermentation. To some extent, of course, it applies to cell-based. We haven't seen really much happening in cell-based space in India yet, right? I believe that we may have one company, maybe, not more than that. So I'm hoping for more startups in this space. And the infrastructure of cell-based infrastructure is a challenge everywhere, actually, not just in India. Possibly the same players can play a role. It is obviously very difficult space to fund by either startups themselves or even VCs. So we need to look at different solutions here.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that globally as well, what we're seeing partnerships between startups and traditional biopharma companies. We're seeing a lot of those partnerships located in what were your traditional API and bio of pharma manufacturing hubs in Thailand and in China, and India really has the opportunity to kind of take advantage of that. But I think like it was discussed on the panel, it's really about engaging some of those traditional industry stakeholders to really see the opportunity that this sector provides as well. But thank you for your comments on that, Michael. There's another more general question here, which is interesting, I think, about particularly geopolitical affairs that are happening right now with the rise in prices of food ingredients generally as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. More generally, as a result of the climate crisis as well, we're seeing agricultural productivity fall. We're seeing in India as well. We've seen the drought affect crop production rates. So how would that come to impact the alternative protein sector? Would that make it more or less difficult to make this industry economical to feed a growing population? How are we seeing those impacts kind of play out? I don't know who wants to take that. Yeah, Robert.
I can take a shot at this. So we have this quarterly conversation with one of the largest burger chains in the world, and these rises of prices don't only affect the alternative protein, it also affects animal feed. It affects anything that goes into animal as well. So what you see at the moment, because there's a lot of other supply chain issues as well related to the animal agriculture sector, these large burger chains, they actually see that and they only look at economics, right? They don't care about it or health. They see that it's actually cheaper to source plant-based ingredients than animal-based ingredients at the moment, and they completely switching their strategies. Yeah. So even though the costs are going up considerably, I think the cost for animal proteins might actually be rising a little bit more than the cost of alternative proteins. So I think this is, I wouldn't call it a blessing in disguise, because it will force a lot of people into hunger and more poverty, and so it's a huge problem. However, for the all protein sector, it shows that it's also more economic. I mean, it's just a much more efficient protein production system than channeling everything through an animal. And I think this conflict only exemplifies that. By the way, the Russian-Ukraine war. I mean, yes, it sort of accelerated that increase in commodity prices. But if you look at the 10 months before the war, it was already on a trajectory that was quite steep. So I think, you know, this is something that we need to start getting used to, unfortunately. And I think it will be more, we haven't seen the end of it yet. But I think in general, net, all protein sector won't be hurt more than what we're competing with.
I just want to check in, Shruti, Samir, if you have any sort of inputs in terms of, you know, potentially leveraging this sector as a sort of like national security and food resilience strategy for India as well, not just for domestic markets, but potentially for exports also.
Yeah, I mean, to add to your, I mean, I think the comment is fair that, look, food security and energy security are going to be key issues, even if you see some of the recent policy announcements where they said, look, we are going to ban the export of wheat. And, you know, which is not what one would have thought would be done. But clearly, I think the comment is that India first, and that would be a comment that would be made by even other states or other countries. So, I mean, I think the broader question in terms of plant protein is clearly one where, given the resource intensity for producing the same kg of protein is basically 4 to 8 times lower. I think, you know, clearly, if anything, this should intensify the rush to sort of say, look, how can we move more towards plant protein? But will it do it? Unclear at best because of the various comments made throughout this discussion. But the other comment is also about desertification of land. 30% of land internationally is subject to sort of desertification risk. So if you can reduce the resources employed for producing protein, obviously, you know, you have to do less of deforestation, which is happening at a very alarming pace in Brazil, in a situation we follow with some, you know, concern or significant concern. So I think, you know, these are all global issues. I think in India, for food security, clearly, I think we have to see how, you know, there are various issues in addition to plant protein, which are the subject matter of a broader discussion on agriculture, which is much more, you know, sort of related to natural farming, use of fertilizers, excessive use of water, and, you know, most of the panelists and people would be aware of, but that's a whole new subject matter. I mean, on balance, I think, you know, plant protein assists us to achieve a higher level of food security, but in the current situation, while the adoption and the knowledge and the awareness is lower, the other ways of sort of managing food security, including policy measures, including sort of, you know, lower use of sort of NPK fertilizers, water protection, will be also as relevant, actually. I think plant protein, fortunately or unfortunately, is still not mainstream globally as well as in India. I mean, if I look at it, it's a very small percent. So I think if you want to have a big problem solved today, this can continue in the background, but there are many more levers you need to address in order to, you know, resolve this problem in the near term for this particular eventuality, which is the Russian-Ukraine war, and for the next 12 months.
Thank you for that. There's a last question that's sort of come into the chat, and Shruti, I would love your opinions here. But essentially, we're talking about, you know, this sector as potentially being an opportunity to diversify farmers' income and really centering the discussion in India at the farm gate. But how is it that we can get marginal farmers within the Indian landscape to actually take advantage of some of these opportunities presented by this sector? Because the crops that we're talking about aren't your MSP crops. They're not crops that you'd see in your mandi. These are, these are crops that we'd really have to develop the supply chain for. So how can farmers and how can we work to sort of get them involved early on within this sector?
Sure. So in fact, one of the pushbacks that you often see from the conventional animal protein industry, and why the government has also been careful treading this topic, is the sheer number of livelihoods that are associated with animal agriculture in India. Dairy is 4% of your GDP. right? So, and the number of small farmers, 2 cows, 3 cows, engaged in the supply chain is huge. And so we will need to look at building of alternative supply chains, where either through contract farming or through even deeper engaged production, you actually help farmers transition to these newer value chains. These are not crops that have not been grown in India. They're just crops. A lot of these crops are crops that have actually been abandoned. If you look at the kind of resource requirements most of these legumes have, they have lesser water requirements, they're more climate resilient. And so what you're actually doing is moving farmers to a value chain that is a lot more climate resilient and a lot more sustainable. And it reduces their risk of income uncertainty as well. But it will require significant effort to create that kind of transition. It will not be all at one go. And frankly, in India, we will not see a total transition. You will see a mix, and newer demand or growing demand will actually get serviced by new value chains that get created. And so, yes, we will need to look at solutions that integrate the small and marginal farmers instead of excluding them. Because as we say, India's transition to net zero is a lot more complex. We cannot afford to trade off people versus planet. We still have significant development goals to meet. And the economically weaker sections are a lot more vulnerable to climate change, and hence you need to build that resilience as well. In fact, if you look at the COP26 framework, the resilience elements of those frameworks actually talk about building income resilience for these vulnerable segments.
Yep, thank you for that. And I think our focus at GFI India as well is really about building a parallel industry that can complement growing demand, that can contribute to diversifying incomes and just building climate resilience within an already broken food system. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts so candidly with us. We will be sharing this, a recording of this webinar to all the startups that constantly come to us and ask us these questions that we asked you today. And hopefully through this, we'd be able to support in having and seeing more capital flow into the sector. So thank you all for the work that you do. Thank you for your partnership, and we look forward to continuing our work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.